This morning's text comes from John, the 18th chapter. We're going to start reading at the 28th verse. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Today we celebrate Christ the King Sunday. It's the Sunday that comes before the season of Advent. It's the last Sunday in what we call ordinary time. Ordinary time is weeks and weeks of time where the scriptures are read and known in the life of the church. And then the season of Advent begins. And actually, the season of Advent is considered the new year of the church because Advent marks the beginning of the year in the Christian calendar. It's the time that we look toward the birth of Christ. But today, before we start looking at the birth of Christ, we are going to remember that today is the day that we recall that Christ lives and reigns with God forever and ever. As the song reminds us, he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and this is the day that we are called upon to remember those things. Now, Christ the King Sunday is actually a very strange kind of day in the life of the church. It didn't get on the church calendar until 1925, so it's a relatively new Christian day of remembrance. Pope Pius XI put this on the calendar in response to what he believed was the increasing secularization of the world. Have we not heard these kinds of things before? What he did is he looked at what was happening in Europe post-World War I and saw that there were a lot of conflicts starting to rise again in Europe. Not only conflicts, but people were coming into power that were demanding loyalty and allegiance. And he was very concerned with that, and following that observation, he also discovered that in Mexico, the government there was actually demanding that its citizens claim loyalty only to the Mexican government. And so the Pope pushed back, and he decided that it was time for the Christian people, the Catholics in particular, to proclaim Christ as King. And so on that feast day, which back then happened in October, people went out into the streets and marched and had parades and had celebrations and food together. They broke bread in their communities together, celebrating the reign of Christ on the earth. It was, in fact, a very strange day, but a way that the church was able to actually say to the systems of power, prestige, and privilege in the world, we are not going to claim our allegiance to you. We're going to claim allegiance to Christ, our King. It is a strange kind of day in the life of the church. Not until 1962 did the holiday or the holy day get moved to the end of the Christian calendar, when the Protestant church started to celebrate that day as well. But it's not only the day itself that's strange. The readings for today are strange as well. You see, for as we are beginning to look and wait for the birth of Jesus, all of the readings for today point to the passion and death of Jesus. So as we begin to wait for the coming of Jesus, we start by looking at the end of Jesus' life. So just for today, as we get ready to put our Advent wreath in the sanctuary and start decorating things all through the church, like all the other churches in North Texas will be doing over the next week, we stop for just a moment to remember that Christ is our King. He came as a baby. He died on the cross. And it is to Christ that we owe our allegiance and our loyalty above all other things. Now, today's reading begins with Pilate. But actually, if you go back just a little before that, you realize that the reading actually starts when Jesus is taken by force out of the Garden of Gethsemane and brought before the Jews, the chief priests and elders of that time, the rabbis that had power, position, privilege, prestige. There they were gathered together, asking Jesus by what authority he did the things he did. By what authority did he say the things that he said? He really didn't give them an answer. So by the time Jesus gets to Pilate, he has already been questioned, he's been beaten, he's been ridiculed, he's been spit on. He has been made to be like any other criminal in that community. So when the Jews get Jesus to Pilate, they bring him simply because they want him to be executed, and Pilate is smart enough to know that. So when Pilate begins to question Jesus, it's not really because he cares about Jesus. Pilate is not going to seek justice for Jesus, because by the end of this ridiculous questioning, Pilate knows that Jesus is innocent of any crime. But he needs to keep the peace in Jerusalem. And to keep the peace in Jerusalem means that he will have to go along with the Jews who want this man executed. And that's how they leave him there. We are bringing you this man Jesus because we need you to execute him, because we are not allowed to do it ourselves. So the very first question Pilate asks, "Are you a king?" And Jesus answers, "My kingdom is not of this world." By his own admission, Jesus claims that he is a king, but he's certainly not a king in the way that Pilate would understand kingship, nor is the kingdom that Jesus is talking about anything like any kingdom that Pilate would be familiar with. Pilate only knows one way of ruling: by power and by force, by demanding allegiance and loyalty. That is the truth that Pilate lives by, the truth of violence. So when he says to Jesus, "What is your kingdom? Where is your kingdom? What kind of kingship do you have?" Jesus' answer is, "I was born to bring the truth. I represent in the flesh the truth." And Pilate's questioned, "What is truth?" Well, isn't that the question we all ask at some point in our lives? Pilate lives by the truth that says might makes right, that absolute power is worth chasing down absolutely, and that people who are of low stature, who have no real force behind them, well, those people, they just don't matter in the world. That is the natural truth that Pilate lives by. A truth founded in violence and force, a truth founded on the backs of the lowest people in the community. The sad truth, for me anyway, is that I don't think that the world has changed a whole lot since the Pilates rose to power. The very first commandment says, "You shall have no other gods before me." Yet our human condition again and again raises certain people to the status of gods who we follow blindly, sometimes simply out of fear, because they have reached a status community-wide, nationwide, of power and might. They have been elevated to a place where everybody listens and nobody speaks truth to power, because we tend to be afraid. We're afraid that if we push back against that power structure, that system that is so firmly in place, that we might find ourselves ridiculed, excluded, or left out of our family systems or social systems that we've grown so accustomed to living in. This was what happened in Jerusalem. The Roman guards were everywhere. Caesar was God. And even though there might have been some revulsion to worshiping Caesar, it was so much easier to go along to get along than to push back on that system. We have not changed all that much since the days of Caesar Augustus. We still tend to worship things that should not have the power of a God in our lives. Jesus was a threat to those Jews in power and to Pilate, because Jesus did speak the truth, and he lived the truth. He, in fact, lived in a way that honored God and honored the people who God created in God's own image and likeness, even the Jewish elite, even the Pontius Pilates in the world. Pilate could not see the truth standing before him. Would we? Would we? Is it not offensive to this day when people are forgiven of something they have done that we don't think should be forgiven? What would it look like if we left here today and we picked up the phone or went to a home of a sibling or a child or a cousin who has done us harm somewhere in our past and offered forgiveness? What if, when we left here today, we decided it was time to reconcile with that friend who we haven't spoken to in 10 or 15 years because they said something that we disagreed with? What if we showed mercy to someone who has done us personal great harm? You know, that person that took credit for the project at work while you were swept aside. what would it look like to actually live under the authority of Jesus? Jesus, our King, instead of living under the authority of the gods that we worship in this world. I would think that it might actually look like God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. It might at least give us a glimpse of the possibility that that prayer that we pray week after week would be manifest in the world that we live in today. Jesus understood the truth of the kingdoms of this world. If Jesus actually operated under the way of the kingdoms of the world, the ways that were considered natural, the ways that we actually still believe are natural, his disciples would have taken by force the people who came to arrest Jesus in the garden. Yet at some point, Jesus said, we are not going to do things that way. God's kingdom would not be ushered in by violence. Christ would never demand loyalty of those who followed him. What he would expect is that by his example of love and forgiveness and reconciliation, people would simply follow. They would see another way. Perhaps it's time for us to say what is natural, what is the natural truth that we have been following all our lives is not natural at all, but it's unnatural. Perhaps what Christ has come and offered us is a real glimpse of what it means to embrace the idea that we are all created by God. And because of that, all people have intrinsic value and worth. What would that look like for us in our communities, in our workplaces, even in our church? What would that look like? Could it be that the church, the early church that grew in leaps and bounds after the resurrection of Jesus, the church that was persecuted, might come alive again in this place? Might we receive the goodwill of all the people, as Don talked about last week when he read from Acts 2? What would it mean to have the goodwill of all the people in the community, that instead of seeing us upholding a status quo, we actually lived in the love that Christ has shown us, that we were people of forgiveness and reconciliation and mercy, that we were the people that said no to power and privilege and prestige? What if we actually used our gifts for the sake of others instead of our own sake? Would that not transform just a little bit the world we lived in? Would it not look just a little different in your home, in your children's homes, in your grandchildren's homes? What would happen if we admitted that we have had it wrong? That the things that we worship and the things that we chase are not the natural things of God, but the unnatural things that this world has forced down our throats for so long we can no longer tell the difference. What if we actually gave our allegiance, our loyalty to Christ first? Would we be different? I would imagine a world where people use their gifts for the sake of others, where we loved one another so much that we redefined what it meant to be family. I would imagine that somehow, in some way, we would sit down with the people who are the most unlike us, the people we have excluded both consciously and unconsciously, and learned what it meant to live in their world, to actually embrace the saint and the sinner. I would imagine that there would be less violence, less hatred, less fear. This is the world that Christ proclaimed. This is the natural truth of the kingdom of God. This is the truth that we are called to live in. This is the Christ who is and was and is to come, the one whom is our King, the one we are called to follow. May it be so, not just today, but all the days that we are given.